Hey, what's going on? I hope you had a really pleasant Thanksgiving. If you are in the States, if you're elsewhere, I hope you had a great day in general. So we're at chapter 4 in the Young Bucks book. I don't have the dust jacket on there. This will help. Dust jacket, yay, of the Young Bucks book. Um, Chapter 4, High Risk Wrestling. This one's written by Nick. So they go into talking about they've just moved, right, to Hesperia, which is about an hour away from where they were. Um, they love the house. And this is the first time that something's been written about in the book that I didn't care for as much. They talk about how they like the new house a lot. One, because they have more room. They each get their own bedroom. The bedrooms themselves are much bigger than they used to be. And but then they talk about how another thing they didn't like about the old house is it was haunted. So way too much of this chapter, my opinion, is devoted to this idea of all the spooky things that happened at their old house. Man, I just didn't give a shit. I ain't mad at it. It is what it is. It definitely shows Nick's personality. He does go into good detail of these sort of ghost stories things. You can see here where I put question marks, where they talk about the choice stuff. But it was cool to see the effects of the quote unquote haunted house that it had on their friends. And that story about the strobe light and all the rest of it was a cool story. I just really didn't. As soon as I hear ghost story stuff, I just check out, and that's my thing. But when they start talking about the wrestling part, that's really cool because remember they have a cool new wrestling ring that their dad has built. They rename the Backyard Wrestling Association into High Risk Wrestling because they didn't want it to sound as backyard. Matt, the older brother, started going as Mr. Instant Replay. It's amazing how many indie wrestlers I know that had some variation of the same, at least as a moniker. Highlight or instant replay, that kind of thing. So back at the Rudo's Dojo Wrestling School. Now Nick is going there as well, and they're belittling him by calling him the little sister because Matt is there. So you really get an indication of who Matt is. He's a really hard worker, really competitive. They go into this thing about how they call him the survivor because of the difficulties of his birth and how he sort of treats everything since. And so they get wrestling gear, at least they get boots, and then they buy everything else at like sporting goods stores. They tape up the Pro Wrestling Illustrated photos. You know, I noticed this book has like the picture part in the middle, as most good wrestling books do, and I'm looking forward to getting to that as well. Um, then the guys are finally getting involved in pro wrestling shows. So the first one, Sonny Sampson and the younger and Nick have to put up the ring and tear it down to get on this show, but they do, and so they team Matt and his brother together against Dustin Diablo and BJ, sexy Sonny Sampson, in a tag match, and I guess they do a pretty good job. And so they start doing shows on the regular, and it's going really great. The stories about the early days and paying their dues and having to dress in chicken suits and in dog costumes and all this crap to wrestle in. Some people might get offended at that notion. That means they weren't really involved in pro wrestling from the ground up. And whatever people want to say about the Young Bucks, it's clear that they were. Backyarders, sure, but they certainly paid those ridiculous dues that all of us pay. I mean, I've got stories as well. And the guys that I trained have stories, I'm sure, of having to be Platty the Platinum Platypus, our mascot, or wrestling in any number of ridiculous things as monsters and whatnot for Atlanta Zombie Apocalypse and all the rest of it. It's just part of the modern wrestling game. So that was really cool to see. A kind of turning point for this thing. They're at the Anaheim Marketplace that they've talked about in previous chapters frequently. And they're doing their thing, right? They're setting up chairs, passing out flyers, refereeing the matches, filming them, all that kind of good stuff. And their dad decides, because they want to start wrestling more, and so the dad ponies up $5,000 through High Spots to get a wrestling ring, and then they're looking for a venue. And their search for a venue really took me back because it's really hard to find places that aren't going to just frickin' scalp you. So they finally find like a roller rink, but the roller rink will only give them Thursday night. $300. I love the specificity. It's one of the things I like about the Cornett books so much is he gives you the numbers and stuff so you can really kind of compare and see how things were. So they have it for 4 hours from 5 to 9 p.m. and $300. But they're doing their thing. And they're making it go. And you're really getting to see how supportive their parents are. Even feeding those 3 boys apparently was quite the yeoman's task, which I don't doubt for a second. And then Nick talks a lot about himself here, which I think is really cool. We're really fleshing out who Nick is compared to Matt. The next chapter is called Superhero Origin Story, written by Matt. So I think we're definitely going to get... Now I feel like I have a fleshed out understanding of who Nick is. I think the next chapter is going to tell us really who Matt is. And Nick leaves us with a bit of a cliffhanger here. This thing at the end of the chapter. We continue to run successful high-risk wrestling shows and would get booked on several smaller shows in the area. Instead of enjoying what we had achieved, however, I kept thinking about the next phase. The survivor in me needed more. And so do we, because the book keeps rolling on along. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you tomorrow for the next chapter. This one, I guess my overall impressions was it was my least favorite chapter so far, mostly because of the ghost story stuff, but there are people who probably will love that sort of insight into Nick's mind and his early childhood and that kind of thing. I wasn't a fan of it, but I was definitely a fan of them starting to make their footholds in the pro wrestling business and the crazy things that they had to do, and then buying a ring on their own and attempting to run their own shows. Because as somebody who's kind of done it all in the wrestling business, it definitely took me back and connected them to even a different way than other books that I felt connected to did, because Jericho never really ran his own show, neither did Mick Foley. So getting to see the Bucks with that level of ambition really makes me see a different side of them and like them a lot. Anyway, I'll talk to you tomorrow.